Welcome to Ivy Podcast, where we bridge the gap between perspectives so that I can venture into viewing the world as you see, and so you can see the world as I view. Hello everybody, and today we've got Sue Elliott here in our studio. I'll be honest, we were recording literally 10 minutes of this and then I realised that I hadn't clicked record, so we're going to just start again, and I'm so sorry. Tell us a bit about yourself and where your involvement in the refugee and the migrant sector, when did it start, and talk to us through your life story of the things that you've done within the sector.
Okay. Kia ora tātou, I'm Sue Elliott. I began my working life as a primary school teacher, and I had a very rural New Zealand childhood. My father was a teacher, so I grew up knowing that schools were part of communities and that if you're a teacher, you're part of the community. Mm-hmm. And in my early 20s, like many young New Zealanders, I went off to the UK. That's where people went at that time. And I thought I was a bit fed up with teaching picked tomatoes for one season, and then I began to think that teaching wasn't so bad, and I got a job in a Vietnamese reception centre, which was a big centre.
In the UK?
In the UK, okay. In the south of England in 1979 in September, because earlier that year there had been a large international meeting where the governments of countries where refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia and Laos had fled from those countries and were in the neighbouring countries in Southeast Asia who did the really hard work around that. And the war in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos had finished, and there needed to be some sort of agreement as to what was going to happen with all those hundreds of thousands of people. And Hong Kong was still a British colony, so the UK agreed to take quite a large number of people from Vietnam. And I got a job working there. I did that for 2 years, teaching secondary school kids and older people who had never been to school before. And I loved that, but it was also, a wake-up call for me around the role of education and how, as a teacher, you were related to people's stories and how our work needs all of us, all of those specialised services. So I did that for a couple of years, came back and I worked in Aotearoa, where New Zealand had also begun about the same time accepting refugees from those countries.
You were there from the beginning?
No, not from the beginning, because I worked in Aotearoa in the community for 5 years, involved in community education. But I lived in that community and I worked in that community and I had friends with those families. And to be honest, we were finding our way. This hadn't been done on such a scale before. And the approach that the people I worked with and I took was, we asked people what they think they need, and then we went away and tried to work out how to do it. So it was a really community development approach, education and resettlement. There were no specialist services. There was a lot of racism within, like working income people still have headaches with, but, it was even worse. So I did that for 5 years, and then I moved to the Mangere Refugee Resettlement Centre as the head of the education program there. So we set about changing that program at that time towards the end of 1987, so this is 35 years ago. To be a program where we learnt from refugees. We employed teachers who came from the background of the people who were arriving because they understood that culture, they understood that journey. They had done well, they had a professional background, and we could, work with them. And we also began to teach about those issues. Because others needed to learn. So it was a time of great change. And then personally I was involved at that time in a group that was set up, established RASNZ New Zealand. That was another, and the Auckland Refugee Council, which is now the Asylum Seeker Support Trust. So there was a large amount of voluntary work around all of that. And then I became more and more interested in the context of refugeehood. What was driving people to be in this situation? And so my study and my work over 20 years was around the intertwining of these issues of what was the causes and around human rights and around refugee issues here. So I worked doing a lot of international consultancy, and that meant I had time to volunteer here. And in my mind, all of that linked up because what was driving people out, and then when people were coming here and meeting these walls of racism, of lack of services. So I've always done a lot of voluntary work in this space. So it's been professional, it's been voluntary, it's been my personal life within my own extended family situation now. And that's just life. But if I've learned anything through all of that, is that the main work of voluntary work is done within communities themselves.
Yeah.
So white people like me get accolades and recognised for working, but within communities, that's where the work is done. Yeah. Those women who help other women when they haven't got family members here, when they have a baby and fill the roles, that's where the real work is. The older men who mediate when there are disputes between families.
Yeah. It becomes like a family more than a community, really. Yeah.
Yeah, and people take on those roles, but that's where the real voluntary work is done. Of course, there's always a role for organised volunteers and for people to speak up, but I think there's a lot of hidden work which is done that isn't recognised. Schools are an institution of our society. Kids learn those main values at home, where people don't have a chance to meet each other and rub alongside each other, where people are living in enclaves where there's not a chance for people to meet together.
Connect and expose, yeah.
Then that's where sometimes I think it's about fear. It's about fear. It's also about unusual perceptions of the way in which the media describe people, and then people grow afraid of particular groups. And it's also about teacher education. So if teachers are not exposed themselves or come from a very narrow background, I'll give you an example. Last year I went to give a lecture at the Polytech in Northland. And I used actually Neymar's, a little video clip with Neymar, and I asked, where do you think she comes from? And, then I said, well, she comes from Mount Roskill. And somebody who had quite a senior position said, but I thought all Muslims lived in Christchurch. So, and it's good that we can have that conversation, that people could... But so, like if you haven't got any exposure, if you've never been to Auckland or you've never been to Mount Roskill, because that's not where you go. And there had been the media exposure of the outrageous massacre in the mosques, then this is what people thought. So this is a really fundamental thing. It's not just about, what's happening in schools, it's what's happening everywhere. And issues to do with racism are sorted out at a neighbourhood level. When neighbours begin to know each other and help each other, then these stereotypes begin to break down. And so I think that schools have an important role ensuring that behaviour is not tolerated, but what's happening in families, what's happening in our wider society, what's happening in teacher education, what's happening in education of health professionals, what's happening when people are feeling under threat, then it's easy to scapegoat others. If people are afraid because they've never met people who are different from themselves, and that's a big burden for kids to carry if they're the only person from a particular background. So I think it's a complex issue, and it's one that needs all of us to be working on, to think about ourselves but also think about how we are welcoming and including others.
Do you find the sector's changed since, give us some examples of where you're like, I never thought so many years later we can do this, like the services we can provide? Or
I'll just use the Asylum Seeker Support Trust as an example. When we first drew up that constitution, and that organisation was formed in 1990, Asylum Seeker Support Trust works with mainly convention refugees and people who are seeking asylum. When it was set up, the Office of the Race Relation Conciliator, it was then, the lawyer there helped us write the constitution. 51% of the board members would be from a refugee background, and the chair always would be. Now, that happened quite a lot. Then there was this big fight within the organisation. I'd gone to the UK and wasn't involved, and the constitution was changed again. And now the constitution doesn't say that. It says, as far as possible, I can't remember the wording, but right now that it's an organisation that employs a number of staff, it runs a hostel. The general manager comes from a refugee background and the chair of the board does. One's from the Middle East and one's from West Africa. Now, that, at the time when we started the organisation, I don't think would have happened. You know, because the lawyers were all Pākehā and now they're not.
Yeah.
There's been a big change.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of change needed, but that's, I think, a really hopeful thing. I look around at families I know that are full of young graduates. Their parents didn't get a chance of going to even primary school, some of them, because of the war and displacement, or they got 1 year education in a refugee camp where teachers themselves were struggling. It was underfunded, it was done on a voluntary basis, which is where the volunteerism starts. And their kids now are graduates. This tells us something about the value of education, about perseverance, about there being some changes in our society. The stereotypes beginning to wear away and whittle away. So those things are just a fantastic change to see.
Do you still stay in touch with some of the families that you remember that had come in, you know, to Mangere Refugee Resettlement Centre? Do you sort of...
Yeah.
Oh, nice. Okay, cool. So you still stay in touch with some of the families?
So people who came to the centre, not so much because people are there for 6 weeks.
Yeah, and then
but staff I work with, of course.
Yeah.
Like, we were like a family.
Yeah.
And also, when I worked in Porirua, if I think about the Lao community, the big group came first in August 1980, and I started working there in 82 and was close to that. And some of those people are close friends. One of the women who was a nurse, we used to go to her and say, what should we do? What do people want? She'd run around, ask old people, and then we'd try and work out how to do it. So through that process, we're the same age. She was a nurse, I was a teacher. Through that process, you become, I mean, why wouldn't you? But, you know, at the same time, somebody once said to me, but they're not really your friends, are they?
You want to cry. What do you mean?
Perplexed. Like sometimes we don't understand each other or we do things in a different way. It was just like a veneer of smiley, plasticky smiley. That, I think's changed.
And I think, like, again, the media has helped that, and accessibility to, like, a lot of stuff online.
Or people taking the initiative themselves and thinking, we're not putting up with this bullshit.
Yeah, calling it out.
Calling it out. Constantly calling it out.
Yeah.
So if you are not from that background, it's a complicated dance of when it's appropriate for you to speak out and when you should speak back.
What was your response when they said that? But they're not really your friends, are they?
I mean, this was a long time ago
now.
I said, of course.
Yeah.
Like, I was a bit puzzled, but, you know, like it stuck in my mind over 30 years thinking, this is strange. But to be working in this field and saying that, like, when I worked first in ESOL teaching, it was really a profession of social justice because you got to know people, you were advocates for people. And then, you know, when that sort of adult education became far more commodified, international students were worth money, there was the focus on IELTS, you know, all of that became commercial. Then it lost its social justice edge.
What are you doing nowadays?
What do I do now?
Talk us.
Well, I am a trustee again of the Asylum Seeker Support Trust, which I've done for about 18 months, having not been a formal trustee for 25 years. I do some work, sort of coaching, supervision, support work for staff across some of the refugee organisations that work with people from a refugee background. And I have some free time for myself a bit more now.
What advice would you have for anyone wanting to get into volunteering in the sector?
I think there are formal ways in which they could be involved, or that might change now with the way in which refugee resettlement in Auckland, moving from the Red Cross, being those volunteers, is a very good way. Through English language partners as a volunteer, other organisations that need one, but also to think about their own profession. You can join a formal way of volunteering, but people can think in their own, they can give money, for goodness sake. Don't give broken plastic toys thinking that people might be grateful. But people can donate. They can raise awareness. They can share information. Don't be a total keyboard warrior, but look for ways. Counter racism. When you hear it, call it out, even if it's uncomfortable. I think there are ways in which everybody can do that little something, doing a bit within your work. And actually, I used to say when students would come to me, then they wanted to go off and do things. Don't think you can go and work on issues of poverty overseas unless you understand how poverty works in New Zealand. Like, understand the dynamics of poverty at home. Of what it's like, of racism at home. Start working on that. And when you understand those dynamics in society, then go. And have a skill to go with. Are you a teacher? Have you got health skills? Have you, have a skill that you can share.
I think a lot of people underestimate the little, how something so little can go so far.
You don't have to be a hero. You just keep chipping away at it.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sue. It's lovely talking to you. Do you have any other advice?
Just keep doing it. You little or a lot for a long time. And I think perseverance and this complicated dance of when's it appropriate and when's it time to step back.
Thank you so much.
This episode is funded by New Zealand Lottery Grants Board. Thank you for your support and generosity.